Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Veg Grower Podcast. My name's Richard and I want to help and encourage you to grow more of your own food. Now, coming up this week, I've had a couple of questions that I want to answer in this week's podcast. One on caterpillars on the Brassicas and another question on how we get lemongrass through the winter. And I finish off with a bit of an update from the home garden. So, without much ado, let's head on down to the allotment and get into this week's podcast. Well, it's a lovely day here on the allotment, and one thing that I've been doing today is just examining my brassicas. Now, over the winter, my brassicas are really going to come into their own. They're going to be something that we're going to be relying on for our winter food. So we want to make sure they're in good condition, well looked after, well watered, well fed, and more importantly, make sure we've got no pests on them. Now, I've recently had a question from a listener who has asked about how I deal with caterpillars on my plants, particularly with brassicas. And this question seemed to come in at just the right time because I've also noticed recently a few eggs on some of my cabbages as well. So it kind of worked out quite well, this question. I know here we are going into autumn, we're not really thinking about pests because they're going to be, well, much less prevalent. But saying that, on some of these nice warm days that we do have I do see some of the cabbage white butterflies flying around. And if they're flying around, there's a good chance they're possibly also laying eggs. So although it seems the wrong time to be thinking about pests, they could still be around. And very important with our winter crops. So the first thing I like to do is I examine all my plants quite regularly. And this is very important because I think when you examine your plants and you see any problems, you can deal with it much quicker if you tackle it straight away. And all I would do, if I see any eggs, I just rub them off, pop them into a bowl, and any caterpillars at the same point I might also put in a bowl. And then I would feed those to my chickens, and they absolutely love them. Now, I don't like killing any animal unnecessarily, including slugs and snails, but I don't mind letting my chickens or other wildlife eat them because I see that as being a natural way of things. Nature has a way of keeping everything in balance, so if they eat these pests, all well and good in my eyes. So yes, examining regularly and removing any caterpillars and eggs is always a good thing. Now, the other thing that I like to do is encourage beneficial wildlife into the garden. Thrushes and little birds that can come along and just hunt down all these caterpillars when I'm not around. They do a much better job than I can. They're there when I'm not around. I've just seen a cabbage white butterfly fly around now, funnily enough. But yeah, getting the thrushes and the little birds in, I think, will help as well. And of course, there are many beneficial insects, predatory wasps as well, that will hunt down some of these caterpillars too. In fact, when I was at Autopot for the recent podcast, one of the things they had in their R&D department that Jason showed me was the use of buying in beneficial insects that hatch in his room, fly around, and that's how they controlled pests, particularly aphids and things. And I really like this. It's something I'm looking more and more into because I think, you know what, it's such a natural way to do pest control. But there are other options, of course. That's not the only option. One of the most foolproof ways of preventing caterpillars on your cabbages is to net them. Now, I don't like nets. I find they get in the way for me doing any work. I've found birds with their feet wrapped up in nets before and things like that. But that's me being a little bit pedantic. I know most allotmentiers, most vegetable gardens, they will net every single brassica while it was growing. One, to keep the cabbage white butterflies off. You know, again, a very important thing, preventing the cabbage white from landing on the cabbages and laying their eggs, which will then turn into caterpillars. If they can't lay their eggs, on your cabbages, they're not going to get to your caterpillars. The trouble with netting is that you do need quite a narrow gauze to prevent cabbage white butterflies. I often see people using quite a large hold net. And what that leads to is the butterflies can still fly through the holes and still get to the brassicas. But it does prevent pigeons from eating the brassicas. So there is a certain advantage to doing this. But if you are doing it because you have problems with caterpillars, you might want quite a narrow gauge. Something else I also like to do is I plant out some, and this is difficult to do over winter if I'm honest with you, but certainly spring, summer, autumn, is I plant out some sacrificial plants. Something like nasturtium I find that the caterpillars are drawn to more than my cabbages. Now nasturtiums are a great example. I'm pretty much growing nasturtiums in every single bed now because I think they're just such a great way for encouraging wildlife, encouraging pollinators, but also pest control. Plus I think they look great and they are edible. And what these do is that instead of the butterflies laying the eggs on your cabbages, they're more than likely to lay these eggs on the nasturtiums, which means the caterpillars are more than likely to eat the nasturtiums as opposed to our cabbages. Now this works absolutely fantastic. Nasturtiums being quite big plants, they can really grow quickly as well, so they can really deal with caterpillars eating on them quite well. Now the final thing that I have recently experimented with, and I've spoken about this before in my kitchen, is nematodes. Now I have discovered there is a nematode pack. It contains several different types of nematodes, if I'm honest with you, but it is specifically designed for vegetable beds. And all we do is add it to some water it onto our bed, and the nematodes are tiny little worms that are like parasitic to certain prey, shall we say. Caterpillars being one of those, or eggs being one of those. But they absolutely work brilliantly in my kitchen when I was dealing with these scarab flies. The downside, of course, with nematodes is you have to reapply them quite often, and they can be quite expensive. But they do work, as I understand it. So that's all the methods that I have in my arsenal for dealing with caterpillars. Self-removal, getting beneficial wildlife and insects to do the job for me, nematodes, netting, and sacrificial plants. I think a combination of all 5 of these, if you have particular problems, will probably work for you quite well. Right, let's find out what's been going on in the Supporters Club, and when we come back I'm going to be talking about herbs. Well, I hope you are enjoying this podcast, and if you are so far, then please remember to leave us a rating and review on your podcast provider. By rating and reviewing, you help more people find this podcast, and these people may also need help with how to grow their own food. Not only that, if you want to support this podcast and the work that we do, then please consider becoming a member of our Supporters Club. For just £5 a month, you get access to extra behind-the-scenes podcasts, as well as a collection of seeds sent to your door every month, and our monthly newspaper that gets sent in with the seeds. So there's quite a bit there for your £5 a month. Now, over this last week in the club, we have actually been sowing some seeds. We've sown some coriander and we have sown some spring cabbage. These were all seeds that were sent in the pack for September, and these are very, very exciting plants to grow, especially as we are now looking at growing food for spring. Now, if this is something you would be interested in joining up and helping us out with, then please head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk to find out more and sign up. Right, let's get back to the gardening. Well, as you can tell, I'm still on the allotment here today, and something that I don't really have growing on the allotment is a herb garden. I'm looking around and thinking of somewhere that I might start to grow herbs here on the allotment. Reason being, herbs of course have many benefits. They're great for pest control, fragrance, and just being awesome edible plants as well. most of my herbs are growing at home, but we had a question come in about lemongrass. Particularly the question was, how can we get lemongrass through the winter? Which I think is a very, very good question. Lemongrass is a native to India, so it's really not a perennial or not frost hardy here in the UK. But if we protect it right, we can keep it growing for many, many years. Now, I like to grow lemongrass from seed, which we normally sow the seeds around March, April time, but it's a very, very long germination time on these. We're talking about 3 weeks. Once they're germinated, of course, we will keep them growing, pot them up, and try and keep them growing in pots. I like to grow lemongrass in pots, like most herbs, because come the winter we can move the pots into our greenhouse. You can, of course, plot it in the ground, but we won't pot our plants outside until early summer, when the night temperature is above 5 degrees C consistently, and ideally day temperatures above 13 degrees C. Lemongrass is fairly easy to look after, just got to make sure they don't dry out or anything like that. They don't need much in the way of feeding, but what I do recommend is that we feed with a bit of chicken manure pellets, like most herbs, every now and then, just to try and encourage them to put on some leafy growth. But at this time of year, we wouldn't be doing that. So, how do we get our lemongrass through the winter? Really, we need to keep lemongrass above 5 degrees C. And this is one of the reasons I always like to grow my lemongrass in pots, because I can easily move the pot into the greenhouse where the temperatures do generally stay above freezing. Now, do they get colder than 5 degrees C? They can do, yes. But what we could always do is just wrap our lemongrass in a bit of bubble wrap or something, just to hold in a bit more heat. And that can work really quite well. And then come the spring, it should start growing naturally. Again, move it outside in early summer. It's just about keeping that temperature above 5 degrees C. I should say my greenhouse is unheated, although I have been considering getting a heater in a greenhouse at some point. But something I do know, when I was a child, I worked as a kitchen porter in a hotel, and the chefs would often send me out to pick up some lemongrass from the herb garden. Now, this lemongrass was growing in the ground all year round, and how were they able to do that? Because our outdoor temperatures, even as far south as I am, do hit below 5 degrees C. Well, the first thing that lemongrass is needed is to be in a sheltered area against a stone wall or something that's just going to retain heat for quite a bit longer, just to encourage that heat to look after that plant that little bit longer. And I find that with a decent, strong plant in the right location, it could well survive the winter months. But not only that, one other thing that I found that the gardeners would do is, of course, around October, November, just before we start getting our first frosts, they would cut the lemongrass right down to the ground level and then cover it over with a good solid mulch. Compost, leaves, that sort of thing. Anything that's just going to protect that plant. And they would leave it all over the winter, and come the spring, it would come back. So it can survive being outside. It's just about protecting it enough during the winter. Now, this is on the south coast of the UK, of course, so we do have fairly mild winters, and we probably get away with warmer temperatures than what you have further up north. And this gives me the idea to share a few other ideas that I have on how we might be able to get outdoor lemongrass growing a little bit longer. So what I would do is, as I just said, cut it down, mulch it over, and then look at using some bubble wrap or something to create like a teepee or a tent just around the plant to protect it a little longer. Now, this could also work if your lemongrass is in a pot as well and you don't have a greenhouse. A nice bit of bubble wrap, which is fairly easy to get hold of these days, fairly cheap, if not free, and has a great way of holding on to heat. Could of course use some very fine netting or enviromesh or something like that that's got known for agricultural uses for holding on to temperature as well. Just acts as like a blanket around our plants to hold on to things like that a little bit longer. This is something I'm going to have to start looking at into getting ready for the winter months, making sure all our meshes and our cloches are ready to get us through the winter months. So I think that kind of covers how we need to get lemongrass through the winter, protect it as much as we possibly can, and come the spring, it should spring back into life. Right, I'm going to head on home and talk to you what's going on in the garden at home. In the meantime, let's find out what Chef Scott has for us this week.
Chopping all the veggies, sizzle in the air. Chef Scott with the magic, smells are everywhere. Water starts to boil, onions hit the pan. Recipe of the week, let the feast begin. Cooking with Chef Scott, flavors come alive. Tune in every week for a tasty bite.
Hi, it's Scott here with this week's recipe. And I recently harvested my main crop potatoes, so I thought I would share a favourite recipe of mine that uses them, and it is Vada Pav, a popular Indian street food dish, also known as Bombay burger. It's a spiced potato patty, fried in a chickpea batter, and served in a soft roll with a selection of Indian chutneys. It's a cheap but flavour-packed dish that you will want to make time and time again. So, let's head to the kitchen and hear how it's made. You can find this recipe and others on the Veg Grower Podcast.co.uk and on my Instagram page, Seed to Table Plot 13. This recipe will serve 4 people and you will need, for the potato patties, 700 grams of peeled potatoes that have been boiled until cooked and tender, 1.5 teaspoons of curry powder, half a teaspoon of paprika, 1 pinch of asafoetida, optional, 1 pinch of ajwain seeds, optional, 1 teaspoon of garam masala, 1 teaspoon of ground coriander, half a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, 1 teaspoon of turmeric, 2 bay leaves, 1 green chilli finely diced, 3 cloves of garlic diced, 1 inch piece of ginger diced, 1 bunch of coriander chopped, about 20 grams, and 100 grams of butter. And for the chickpea batter, 90 grams of gram flour or chickpea flour, 160 millilitres of water. Method. Start by cooking the potatoes. Cook them just like you would for mashed potatoes and drain them off and set aside. Now add the 100 grams of butter to a saucepan and on a medium heat, add the ginger, chilli, garlic and chopped coriander and cook for 1 minute. Now add all the spices and cook for another minute, then add the cooked potatoes and mash everything together, then shape into 4 patties. Now make the chickpea batter by whisking together the gram flour and water. Then dip the patties into the batter and deep or shallow fry until golden brown and crisp. Then served in a soft roll with your favourite chutneys. I like green coriander chutney, tamarind chutney and mango chutney. And that's the recipe done. And that's it from me this week.
Well, I'm back in my garden at home now. It's been a very productive week here at home, to be fair. And it's so much quieter here now as well, I've got to say. So I thought what I would do today is just give you a quick run through of what's been happening here at the Veg Grower Podcast garden. Now, first of all, one thing that I've had to do, and this is a bit of a message to everybody who has chickens. From October, every chicken owner or every chicken has to be registered. A little bit annoying, but this is with DEFRA, but this is all to do with the bird flu problems that we've been having in recent years and trying to keep them under control, etc, etc. It's not hard to do, just simply go to the website, fill out all the details and off we go. So something we have to do now, a little bit annoying, but hopefully it'll help control bird flu. Fingers crossed, because bird flu has been a problem for many people over the last few years. Now, my beds here are still quite full. I've got one bed that had the peas in, which is the empty bed, but I'm currently just hurrying through that to make sure we cleared all the weeds, because that's where our garlic and onions are going to go fairly soon. In one of the other beds, we've had a couple of spaces. So I've got some carrots, celery, and some beautiful red mustard grown in it. It's red mustard, big leaved. It looks absolutely stunning, I've got to say. But I did have some spaces here. So what I've had to do is I've emptied my wormery from all the worm compost. And what I do when I empty my worm compost is I put my worm compost into my rotary sieve. Now, what this rotary sieve is, it's got legs that stand on the ground and lift the actual sieve off the ground, but it has a handle that we turn, and it turns a little metal bar which just helps sieve through all the worm compost. Very little effort, I've got to say, which is one of the reasons I bought this. And the other advantage of having this is that when I run through my worm compost, it actually breaks up all the eggshells as well, which adds eggshells chopped up into the garden. I use this as a mulch and just cover it all over. Eggshells have many advantages in the garden. Adds calcium. Slugs and snails don't tend to like it, so it's a good thing to add, but you do need to make sure they are composted first. I just throw eggshells into my worm compost bin as they are. Some people will bake them and break them up before adding them to the compost bin. I see that as being extra work, and I don't really want to do it. I just let the worms do their business. When they finish doing their job, I will then just run it through my rotary sieve. Anyway, we've put this compost down, added a bit of mulch basically, and then I've planted into these areas some pak choi and some rainbow chard. I love both of these plants. I think they look great. We eat a lot of pak choi with some of our green Thai curries, and it's a great plant that is fairly hardy, should give us some harvests just before the frosts come in. And the chard as well, these are a mix of the red, the whites and the yellows, which I think look absolutely stunning in any garden or on any allotment. And I have found chard to actually be quite hardy. It can pretty much grow right through the winter here. So I'm definitely one for growing chard. Adds a bit of colour, provides us with some really nice tasty food as well. But overall, the beds are providing us with plenty of food. We've got two other of the large beds, that's what I'm concentrating on today really. Brassica bed that has got swede and cabbage and kale, all of which are doing fantastic in there, and I haven't really got much to do with that bed. And then the second Brassica bed, this has only recently became a brassica bed. It did have some fennel and other things growing in this bed, which I've removed. But I've planted out some sprouts and kale and cabbages to keep us going throughout the winter as well. I've actually got some more cabbages to go into here, but overall, these beds are becoming productive. One of the problems I am finding, however, and this is something I think I might discuss with you, is with regards to our summer raspberries. I've got a bit of summer raspberries, but they do get very, very tall, very, very overhanging. In fact, underneath on the pathway around these, the grass doesn't grow because they're being shaded out so much by these summer raspberries. Now, I might actually dig up some of these summer raspberries and thin them out, of course, but look at getting some different varieties. They've been productive, don't get me wrong, but I think there's better raspberries more suited to the home garden than this. Our autumn raspberries, however, we're getting loads and loads of yellow raspberries at the moment, which is going down very, very well. Now, we've also got quite a few tomatoes still growing, and best of all, these tomatoes are producing lots and lots of tomatoes every single day. We're getting really a good amount of tomatoes. I'm thoroughly enjoying all of them, and we're using them in lots and lots of different dishes. Now, here at home, I'm quite lucky because our tomatoes are not showing any signs of blight, whereas tomatoes down on the allotment are showing signs of blight. So there is a little bit of trying to be careful not to spread this horrible fungal disease between the two plots, which we seem to be doing. And I do grow blight resistant tomatoes, which work quite nicely, guarantees I will get a harvest. But mixed in with that is some of the non-blight resistant varieties. Down on the allotment, as I said, there's a mixture, same varieties that I have here at home, and blight is running through those tomatoes quite rapidly. But here, no blight at all, plenty of tomatoes that are coming through, and I'm thoroughly enjoying them. Cucumbers and other things like that have also done well. I'm not quite ready to pack up the home garden just yet. I do try and grow all throughout the year, as I'm sure you know. It's the idea of this podcast. We're growing all year round. So I'm certainly not ready to pack up this garden and sort of say to myself, you know what, we're packing up for the winter. No, we're not going to do that. We're going to try and garden all year round and grow food all year round. One of the things that I do think as gardeners we tend to do is we try and have this autumn tidy up where we clear away a lot of the stuff that insects might use or wildlife might use for homes throughout the winter. Sometimes I think we're too tidy as gardeners, and that's not very good for nature and wildlife. Now, I'm not a wildlife or a nature gardener, I'm an edible gardener. But I do believe in working with nature to provide us with some of the best food possible. So, not so much a tour of the home plot, more of an update from this home plot, from what's been going on over this last week. Plenty of food still growing here, plenty of produce coming on. There's definitely a lack of squashes though this year. Squashes and beans are a massive lack of, but hopefully next year that will be okay. Right, I'm going to head on back into the podding shed and wrap up this week's podcast. Well, I'm back in the podding shed now. It's time to wrap up this podcast. Hope you've enjoyed it, and if you have, then please leave us a rating and review on your podcast provider. It only takes you a few seconds, but it really does help us get found by more people. It gets the algorithms working for us. I'm sure you've heard a lot about algorithms. Very, very important part. Now, Lynn has left us a review over on Spotify about last week's episode, and she says, great episode, good idea to discuss autopods for the whole episode. I think I'll pop one on my Christmas wish list. Lynn, don't forget the discount code AUTO10RVG if you do get one. But I've got to say, I really enjoyed putting together last week's podcast and the whole recording of it, starting way back in May and having it going on right through the year. This is something I would like to do more of with the right type of content. But I really enjoyed last week's podcast, I have to say, and Autopod themselves have really enjoyed it, and I'm really, really happy with that. So I'm glad you've enjoyed it as well, Lynn, and hopefully many, many others. Now, added to that, if you want to help support this podcast, then please consider becoming a member of our supporters club. Details on that are at the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk, but for just £5 a month, you get access to extra behind-the-scenes podcasts, collection of scenes sent to your door every month, as well as our mini newspaper. And if you want to get in touch, you can of course head to the veggrowerpodcast.co.uk. You can leave a comment or leave a voicemail using our SpeakPipe service. Very easy to do, but it really does work quite well. If you want to email me, richard@veggrowerpodcast.co.uk is my email address. It's always good to hear any emails. I have been a bit lax with getting back to emails, but it's always good to hear some emails from listeners because it's nice to hear feedback. And of course, you can find me on social media, pretty much every platform, but we do also have a Facebook group where there's a lot of conversations going on as well. It's good to get members in there talking too. We will be back again next time, so until then, please take care.